Technology and Human Rights Conference of 2020. My name is Jessica Wyndham, and I'm Director of the AAAS Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights and Law Program. I'm also Coordinator of the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition. I want to start by thanking the team of Teresa Harris, Joel Erickson, Nate Weisenberg, Jonathan Drake, and Jordan Schwartzbach, who've made the shift to a virtual conference possible and I believe have exploited to their maximum the opportunities that an online gathering provide, including attracting a global slate of speakers and also of participants. And welcome to everyone. To paint for us a picture of the context in which we're meeting, it's my great honor to introduce AAAS Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Sudip Parikh. Dr. Parikh, who holds a PhD in macromolecular structure and chemistry, joined AAAS in January of this year, after having spent 2 decades working at the nexus of science, policy, and business. He's the son of Indian immigrants who worked in the textile and furniture manufacturing plants of North Carolina. He's the father of 3 young children, and in this role is a keen volunteer mentor for Science Olympiad teams. And he's undoubtedly the first AAAS CEO to manage the organization from his basement through a pandemic, coinciding with a time of immense social reckoning, with a view to how the scientific community can contribute to a social awakening. So with that, I turn the screen over to Dr. Parikh.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. You know, one of the I guess the upsides of the way we're working is that we are able to have a broader audience for this important conference, and that is in a time where there are many things not to be thankful for. That is something to be thankful for, because I think that the reach of this conference and the ability to motivate and to hopefully excite people about how science can really play a role in improving society, I think is a message that we need to get out to more and more. And I think that we have a generation, a cohort in our young scientists who are wanting to do this, who are wanting to be involved. And I'm so eager to see AAAS and our collaborators and partners around the world help manifest that. You know, growing up, as Jessica mentioned, I grew up in North Carolina, and when I was growing up, science and studying, they were a refuge from things that I didn't enjoy. Right, I stood out a little bit. It wasn't always the happiest time, but science was a refuge from all of that. And I growing up, I thought that it was the refuge. It was a place of what I thought was meritocracy, of what I thought was really being able to forge your own path. But what I came to learn over time is that really there aren't any bubbles. Even science is not a bubble. There are, as you start to experience the world, you see that that even the ideal of science doesn't always match up with the reality. And what I came to find is that those bubbles don't exist. And then when 2020 happened, it really forced, I think, the entire scientific community to hold a mirror to ourselves and say, what are we about? Who are we and what are we about? And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about that in the next few minutes, hopefully setting the stage for what I hope is the foundation that might be tragedy, but it's an opportunity born of this tragedy. And these moments come every generation. Every generation has opportunities born of tragedy. And what separates the generations that make progress and those that don't are keeping the momentum, keeping the conversation alive, keeping the actions alive, keeping the conversation alive about the issues that matter, and making sure that we are broadening who does science and for whom science is done. Both those apertures need to open. And so I'm going to talk just a bit about that in the next few minutes. I do have a couple of slides I'll share with you. There's one piece of data I wanted to show you because I thought it was really truly interesting. So forgive me as I try and get my slides to share. Wonderful. All right. This is from a a survey that was done by 3M. It's called the State of Science Index. It's done worldwide. It talks about the barriers to STEM education that are holding students back. And if you look at these, if you look at the bars, you see a lack of access to science classes in my school is 36%, but that's worldwide. In the US, the highest percentage here is inequalities, my gender, my race, and or my ethnicity. 50% of students that were surveyed say that barriers to STEM education that are holding them back are inequalities. That's a mind-blowing number. I mean, it's just, it's extraordinary. And this is another piece of data from that same survey. Too many students have already been discouraged from a career in STEM. And this is actually growing over time. So boomers, 9% were discouraged from STEM education. Gen X, 15%. But if you get to Gen Z, it's 28%. That's more than a quarter of our students in the United States who are being discouraged from choosing science and technology and education and math from actually doing this wonderful, important work. And if you look at the biomedical sciences, this shows up in the data, right? So this is, I know there's a lot on this slide, but if you look at the bars, they represent the entire biomedical workforce in terms of race and gender. And what you see over time is that if you have an associate's degree, underrepresented men and women have a higher proportion of the jobs in STEM or in biomedical support, in biomedical research. But as you get farther and farther through career tracks, by the time you get to full professor, you find that there are almost no underrepresented men, very few underrepresented women, and even with well-represented women, the numbers are tiny by the time you get to full professor. And you all know this, so I don't want to belabor the point because you've all seen this in your everyday lives. But that's looking at ourselves. And so at AAAS, we decided that once the events of 2020, and when I talk about the events of 2020, I'm speaking very deliberately about the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, others, that caused us to have a reflection. And I'll tell you that what really drove it were young people. We were, as we were monitoring the reactions to these tragedies, young people came together and they wanted to start something called Shut Down STEM, a hashtag Shut Down STEM. And at first, as an older Gen X, shutting down STEM felt like the wrong message, right? I wanted to open up STEM. But in talking and having conversations with these young people, I realized they wanted to shut down STEM for a day, to spend time thinking about what are the issues and challenges that we need to start talking about. It's not the end of the conversation, to the beginning of a conversation. And so we did that. We took down all of the AAAS websites. We went dark. We put up just a place for people to comment. We didn't have any external communication. We actually just listened, and we invited people to listen. And out of that, and through a series of conversations, came a series of draft plans for us to address systemic racism within the sciences. And so we've started with 3 draft plans. The first is to hold up a mirror to ourselves to ensure accountability. And that is about demographic representation in AAAS functions. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the second is really, what are we going to advocate for? What is, we have a loud voice in the sciences. What are we going to advocate for that will truly make a difference? And then the third is how we actually work on DEI within AAAS itself. When I talk about AAAS, we are an enabling organization. If you publish in Science Magazine, you are on your way to a career in the sciences. If you are recognized as a AAAS elected fellow, you have added credibility and stature to your already large accomplishments that enable you to have a bigger platform. If you receive a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, you are on your way to a career in science policy, and on. This is what we do. We enable careers. And so That's the positive look at it. The negative look at it is we're a gatekeeper organization. If you don't win these things, you have a harder time making your way in the sciences. And so we believe that transparency leads to accountability. And so we are collecting the demographic data in each of our selection functions. So these are the places where we make selections for S&T policy fellows, where we review submissions to Science Magazine. And we want to look at that demographic data, and then we're going to publish it annually. We're just going to make it public so that the scientific community can hold us accountable. And frankly, the scientific community and society can hold us accountable. Our mission is to advance science and serve society. So we're going to commit to providing clear data that doesn't obfuscate trends. As a leader, it's sometimes you want to tell a good news story. And so if you put everything together into underrepresented minorities, it's amazing how you can make those numbers look pretty good. And you can certainly hide trends that are scary for when you get the data to be more granular. In many cases, this data is completely voluntary self-reporting. Almost all of it is voluntary self-reporting, which means that there are huge gaps in the data. And this is why most organizations would not do this, and why, as a leader, it's a scary thing to do. But frankly, we have to start somewhere. And as I said, the thing that separates the generations that make progress from their opportunities born of tragedy is starting and continuing. And so that's what we've committed to. So these are some of the areas across AAAS that we are going to present this data in. It's coming out actually at the end of this month. I hope that you will dig into it. It has huge limitations and concerns. I will mention those, and we go into a great deal of detail about what these are in our reports. But just some summaries: there are data issues that will need to improve over time. It's an imperfect process, and that therefore transparency is key, as I think it is in all of our work. Transparency is key because if you give the caveats of what the problems are, then people can try and help you fix them. And as I say, if it were easy, everyone would do it. I had the team go out and do a landscape of maybe other organizations have done this before. No one has. And so we're going to go through and look at imperfect data using an imperfect process, but we believe that the benefits outweigh the risks, because we think that once you have this data, you can look at it, and I think looking changes the outcome. And let me just give you one example of that before I end. This is a look at some of the data. So this is the folks who are honorary fellows of the AAAS. So this is a process, it's a nomination process where 3 current elected fellows say, you know what, this other person in our field has done important enough work to be recognized as a fellow. When you look at this data, first of all, you can look at the gender data. That's the bottom rainbow chart there. The gray is where we don't have data. The blue is male, and I'm bad at colors. The red is female. 73% to 20% is the number there. Extraordinary. If you go up to the larger rainbow, this is the race and ethnicity data. The gray again is where we don't have data, but the overwhelming majority there is white, and then Black and African American is 0.8% of all the data. 0.8%. So you see, this does not look like America. This is the Honorary Fellows class just for 2019. I put this up here because it hasn't changed much. The previous was all living. This is the current year for 2019. Let me contrast that with the S&T Policy Fellowships. This is an application-based program. This is one where students who've just graduated with their PhD can apply to work in Congress or work in the executive branch. Here, this looks like America. Look at the gender data. This is 64% female and 35% male, even overrepresentation of women. But then if you go up to the top, white non-Hispanic is about 63%, Black or African American is about 10%, Asian is about 11%, Hispanic is about 8%. This looks like America. What's the difference here? The difference is an application-based process, and the selection committees, this is the selection committee, is also diverse. It also looks like America. So this is preliminary data that I could talk about, but we're committed to continuing this and going forward. So I'm going to I don't want to overstay my welcome, so I'm going to stop there as far as data and tell you that I am proud that AAAS is a partner and a collaborator in this conference, because we learn from you all, and hopefully you all learn from us as well. And together, we're going to take this opportunity born of tragedy in 2020, a year that I'm looking forward to the end of, and I'm sure you all are as well, and really make progress from this by keeping the momentum, continuing to talk about it, and continuing even when the news has moved on. And I look forward to working with all of you to make that happen. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Dr. Parikh, so much. And I want to thank you for putting AAAS in the sometimes lonely and risky position of leading, but with a conviction that it's our responsibility to act. So thank you. And thank you also for really laying down the gauntlet for all of us, encouraging us to meet the challenges of our time with action. So with that, we're now going to turn to the first panel of the conference, focused on the right to science. This is a right that was first recognized internationally in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and it was later enshrined in a binding international treaty to which 171 countries are a party. But as you probably know, recognition of a right in a treaty means little if governments responsible for implementing the right and civil society concerned with advocating for the right, monitoring it, don't know what the right really means. So it is that AAAS and the Science and Human Rights Coalition have for over a decade engaged the scientific community in defining what the right means, at each step of the way working with the United Nations to bring these perspectives to their task of defining the right. Finally, in April of this year, the United Nations approved a definition, or a definitive interpretation, I should say, of the right. Mission accomplished. Well, not really. It's really mission launched. The groundwork has now been laid for the real work to begin using the right as a tool to affect change. So that brings me to our panel. We've brought together 3 individuals who've each given great thought to how the right to science can be applied in practice. And each has been asked to talk about why they are excited about this important step taken at the United Nations. I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves. Their biographies are available on the conference website. And to start us off, Dr. Rebecca Everly.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, even if only in spirit. Thanks so much for inviting me. I direct the Committee on Human Rights of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And I also direct something called the International Human Rights Network of Academies and Scholarly Societies. And essentially that's a consortium of national science academies around the world with a shared interest in human rights. And both of these organizations are deeply involved in advocating for scientists, engineers, and health professionals who come under attack, often because of their research and their professional activities. I should say that we do so largely behind the scenes. So some examples of tools that we use are submissions to international and regional human rights complaint bodies. We engage in, we hold private meetings, we send lots of letters of appeal, and we mobilize members of national academies around the world to support colleagues. Increasingly, we're engaged in exploring broader issues of involving the intersection between science, engineering, health, and human rights. So we're excited about the general comment for many reasons, and I'll talk about that. Today, I'm going to focus my comments specifically about the role of the general comment in supporting advocacy for scientific freedom. I'll also share some other more general observations. But first, really, I just want to congratulate those of you who have been working to really breathe life into the right to science for so long, including members of this panel and I'm sure the Zoom audience as well. And of course, I want to specifically congratulate AAAS and the Science and Human Rights Coalition and Jessica, of course, for, as she mentioned, working for more than a decade to help define this right that is so important to us all. And, just to say, in this situation, as all of you know, in this situation where we're facing this pandemic that is really just laying bare the inequalities in our society and deepening them, I think it's even more clear than ever how important it is to have international standards on science that really center human rights and dignity. So I think the general comment is certainly a major milestone on this path. So congratulations. So I mentioned that my comments will primarily focus on advocacy. That's probably the most immediate impact that the general comment has on our work related to advocacy and support of scientific freedom. And as I mentioned, our organizations advocate for colleagues under threat, often because of their research. And who are these folks, or what's happening to these folks? Often it includes individuals who are on trial, who are arbitrarily detained, often for long periods of time. Colleagues who have received death threats, their families have received death threats, and they've been subjected to all sorts of other really problematic treatment. And, I think for some people, this is, particularly pre-COVID, this is a bit of a surprise. There's really this pattern of attacks on scientists, but I mean, it's certainly the case. And it often happens, as you would imagine, in cases where governments are really interested in maintaining a monopoly on the flow of information within their societies, and societies where there's not a lot of transparency, where dissent is viewed with a lot of suspicion. And in such situations, which occur all over the world, and we faced it in our own in the United States, scientists and researchers often are viewed as a threat. So I think people are starting to understand this problem a bit more during COVID-19, as many human rights organizations and media outlets have documented attacks on public health experts and scientists who are involved in COVID response. So I'm sure you've seen reports of, again, death threats against scientists and public health experts, the detention of them in some cases. And, really, I think this is, it happens in a few different categories, but one category is situations where scientists, health experts are providing information on the pandemic that differs from the information and recommendations provided by the government. Another situation where scientists really come under threat is where in situations where they've been critical of government response to the pandemic, for instance, related to lack of PPE, inadequate PPE. So, having said that, this again, it's not a new problem. Our committee within the U.S. National Academies has been working for nearly half a century now. And, I decided not to share my slides because of my ineptitude with tech, but I'm just going to give you a few examples, just 5 examples of the types of cases that we have worked on over the years. So we have worked in support of colleagues who have researched so-called sensitive topics in their countries, including the rights of women, individuals who have published statistics that are inconsistent with information provided by their governments, colleagues who have documented and shared information about serious threats to public health, folks who have authored scholarly articles seen as overly critical of government policies, and people who have refused to apply their scientific knowledge to certain projects with which they have ethical objections. And when governments have attacked or targeted individuals who do this kind of work, they do so on a variety of grounds, often using domestic law to argue that these individuals are, for instance, a threat to national security. So since this is a big chunk of our work, you can imagine that we are very happy to see the discussion in the general comment of the obligations on governments to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research. And the general comment, of course, elaborates on this freedom. It provides a list of examples of scientific freedom, although it's a non-exhaustive list. And I'll just give you a couple of examples from the general comment itself. So it refers to the importance of protection of researchers from undue influence on their independent judgment. It talks about the sharing of scientific data and analysis with policymakers and with the public whenever possible, and the importance of that. So we can see why that's important at the moment. And the general comment talks about, it provides for the possibility that scientific can be limited, but really crucially, it's also clear that governments don't have free rein to simply decide what those limitations are. And the general comment, as many of you know, has a limitations clause that among other things, says that limitations have to be established by law. They need to promote the general welfare in a democratic society. They need to be proportionate to the aim pursued. And the burden is really on the government to justify restrictions on scientific freedom. So, this is still quite general. We'll see how the general comment is fleshed out in practice. But for us, it's really, I think, an important new sort of tool in the toolkit of advocates for scientific freedom. And, we use international law a lot, all the time in our work. We're making arguments based on the right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of association, other rights. But in some ways, really, the right to science is, and specifically this piece regarding scientific freedom, for us, it's like a missing piece of the puzzle, because it deals with a very specific type of harm. And I think, a harm related to associated with the punishment of individuals, researchers who are seeking to foster further understanding of nature and society through a process of critical inquiry. So it's the punishment of those individuals. It's the prevention from, it's preventing them from doing that work. But it's also the associated harm for individuals who could potentially benefit from that research and that knowledge. So, we'll see how things develop. But if we make robust use of this right in the general comment, and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is engaged in individual cases of concern and is working to define the nature of rights and permissible limitations, I think, really the general comment in some ways could be a gift that keeps on giving to human rights practitioners as we use it to hold governments accountable for meeting their obligation to fulfill the right, respect, protect, and fulfill the right to science. So the final thing I want to mention about advocacy is that in some cases, our colleagues, scientists, engineers, health professionals, have themselves been targeted for abuse using the products, using scientific products and the products of technology. For instance, where their biometric information is collected without their consent, in cases where they've been subjected to really highly intrusive surveillance. And I can see the general comment being useful in responding to those cases as well, both with the government's concerned, but possibly also in advocacy involving companies that sell products that are used for repression. So before I close, I just want to pull back a bit and talk about what I see really as, and many people I think see as, the promise of the general comment in terms of forging connections between the scientific and human rights communities, and also promoting human rights-based approaches to science. So I've mentioned that I work with academies that have a shared interest in human rights. And several of those academies have human rights committees. But historically, their focus has been on the issues that I've discussed so far, the issues related to scientific freedom. However, I see a lot of interest within those academies around the world in exploring the relationship of human rights to their core scientific work. just to take an example, we're in the process of preparing a project that looks at the different examples of academy work on human rights and inequality. What are academies doing in that space? And we found that there's a lot of really interesting work. So, just to give you a few examples, work on education and the digital divide, health inequities, structural racism, domestic violence, impact of COVID on children, impact in situations of detention. So, these issues obviously are so closely bound up with human rights. Academies are interested in exploring these issues. What I think hasn't happened yet, the missing piece, another missing piece of the puzzle, is that there hasn't been, to my knowledge, systematic engagement with relevant international human rights law and its interpretation by international and regional human rights bodies. It's happened in some cases, but not across the board. And I think there's a real need for this. And one reason why I think there is a real need to this is because I think there is at least potentially power in talking in terms of rights and the obligations associated with those rights. So, when we say under international law, individuals have a right to benefit from scientific progress without discrimination. They have a right to access science education. They have a right to participate in science. They have a right to information about the risks and benefits of technology. And then when we say that states have corresponding obligations, that's something different than saying this is a good practice. It's a nice thing to do. We might consider it. The other thing I would say is that, just to reiterate what Jessica said about that, of course, the right to science is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's enshrined in an international treaty to which most states in the world are party. For scientific bodies that are seeking to address societal challenges, I think it's really important to have an understanding of these rights and obligations and how they've been fleshed out. And then the final thing that I want to say is just that, there are all obviously such rich discussions taking place about challenges in society like public health and sustainable development, climate change, all the issues that I mentioned before that academies are looking at. And those discussions are taking place within the scientific community, certainly. They're also taking place within the human rights community. However, I think often these discussions are taking place in parallel, and the insights that they produce aren't always shared. So I think it's important to find ways to build bridges between the scientific and human rights communities. It's happening to a certain extent. I mean, obviously this conference is an example of that, but we really need more in order to bring different types of knowledge and skills to bear on difficult problems and challenges. And, don't mean to suggest by any means that that's going to be easy. We can talk about all the challenges later. There are problems of institutional culture, education, training. But, at least, I just want to say that I do reiterate that I do see a real desire on the part of many members of the scientific community to explore the relationship between their work and human rights, particularly when it comes to issues related to systemic inequality and structural injustice and inequality. I'm seeing that. And I think one of the most significant aspects, ultimately, of the general comment is that it helps us provide us with a framework and a vocabulary to use as we work to embed human rights and social justice into scientific work. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, very much. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Gisa Deng to speak on this topic.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everybody. Good morning from me, at least. I'm very excited to be here to be able to present on behalf of Treatment Action Group. Treatment Action Group is an independent, activist, and community-based research and policy think tank fighting for better treatment, prevention, a vaccine, and a cure for HIV, tuberculosis, and the hepatitis C virus. I I am going to share my slides in a sec. All right, here we go. And I want to, before I dive into the actual presentation that I prepared, I wanted to say that I'm excited because I already heard so many words and terms just now and from the previous speakers that really resonate with our work: opportunity, transparency, who does science, who is science for, emission launched, certainly how we're feeling, laying bare the inequalities of life around us, the flow of information, a new tool in our toolkit, and rights and specifically obligations. So we're excited because this is really a coming to life process. This is the beginning of a whole new chapter, and a whole new body of work and learning can happen now with the publication, the adoption of the general comment. As Jessica said, even within the UN, the right to science isn't all that well known. And if we were in a room together, I'd ask for a show of hands for those that felt comfortable talking about the right to science. Unfortunately, I can't see you, so we'll skip that. But this is really why we need a general comment. It's an extensive analysis of a specific right within an international covenant. For example, because there's already been a general comment on the right to health, accessibility, affordability, acceptability, and quality, known as the AAAQ, are now accepted as an analytical framework for measuring progress on the right to health. And a lot of campaigns were organized around the AAAQ. And that's why it's been so powerful in terms of the right to health, because it's been sparking and shaping policy advocacy. We didn't have a similarly accepted interpretation of the right to science. Now that we have one, we know for certain what obligations states have as duty bearers. We now have fairly clear standards against which each country's progress on right to science implementation can be measured. And just as a quick background history, you'll see just if you look at the years, not much has happened for a while between 1948 and now. But in 2018, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights had a meeting in Geneva about the general comment and the drafting process. We didn't hear much after that, but suddenly earlier this year, the draft appeared, and then they moved really quickly. And again, very excited because the adoption of the general comment on the right to science is, as Becca said, a major event for human rights advocacy. And I want to talk about why that is. Again, it's because until now, we've really been working only from the very brief text in the Covenant, Article 15, a couple of reports issued by the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, and a small amount of academic literature. We had, you could say, little basis for our arguments. But now we have this authoritative language and an explanation of how the right is supposed to be understood, what states are obligated to do, example of how the right to science relates to other rights. And we're at TAG are especially excited because the general comment agrees with many of the arguments that we've been making for quite a while. For all its challenges and frustrations, the UN Human Rights Framework is an important catalyst for global activism. For one, because a human rights framework unites people and ideas with actions. This is a key component of activism, and this concept probably sounds familiar to many of you. Human rights also unite people because they're universal. A human rights framework, again, provides this common language to issues that activists encounter everywhere across the world. This language allows us to frame an individual experience as part of a systematic, broader issue. It enables an individual or a community to move from understanding a specific plight as happenstance to seeing it as a systemic piece and then doing something about it. So now with this general comment, we can move away from our lonely desk research to organizing. We can create educational materials, toolkits, guides, workshops, so that people can better understand the right and how it applies to them and their situations, the issues they're working on, so that they can start actively engaging and utilize their right in their activism. And another reason to be excited is that the general commons adoption is also extremely timely, as you can probably imagine by now, and as you'll see in a moment. It's almost as if human rights and science were the answer to 2020. The right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its application immediately raises a lot of questions. Who produces science? What do scientific benefits entail? Is there a difference between scientific knowledge on the one hand and scientific applications on the other hand? Who can access benefits? And how should governments best promote science when non-state actors carry out so much of the research? The general comment helps us answer some of these questions, and in the context of health, where we're working, it applies to both new global health challenges, such as COVID-19, but also old challenges, such as TB and HIV. Participation is, as explained by the general comment, a really central value of the right. And we're excited because of this quote that I pulled out for you, that the right to science encompasses not only a right to receive the benefits of the applications of the scientific progress, but also a right to participate in scientific progress. So there's no rigid distinction between scientists and the general public. This really validates the rich tradition of community engagement in global health research and policy formulation. For example, both in HIV and TB, people affected by the diseases have been participating for a number of years in shaping the scientific research agenda through community advisory boards. One example is the Global TB CAB. But while the GC supports this approach, we are now witnessing an unnerving retrenchment into non-transparency as part of the global COVID-19 response. We're actually regressing on participation right now. There have been no opportunities for community input into vaccine clinical protocols, something that has become standard, for example, in HIV vaccine trials. It was only in mid-September that the Moderna phase 3 COVE study publicized its protocol, and an accompanying recent review of NIH-registered trials for COVID-19 vaccines also shows really worrying data that could have been avoided with community participation. There's a very low percentage of non-white trial participants, and most trials don't disaggregate for sex. Very few trials considered sex and gender in recruiting participants. And that's a problem because we already know that sex and gender can determine incidence of COVID infection and mortality. And that not disaggregating for sex can lead to over-medication and unwanted, unnecessary side effects in any treatment or vaccine that will come out of these. And we know also from decades of TB and HIV that for implementing any scientific response, we need community to point out challenges and be engaged at each stage of research, yet we're ignoring this right now. Another reason that we're excited about the general comment and it's the text is that the general comment talks about access as something that not only encompasses knowledge and information, but also the material results of scientific progress, such as medicines and vaccines, as well as the means, methods, and materials of scientific discovery. And this really strengthens the access to medicines movement because this means that tangible outputs of science, such as new health technologies, are benefits that should be accessible to all. And again, we know from TB and HIV responses that we also need community participation to make sure people can actually access what is available. A vaccine, once developed, does not immediately eradicate a disease. It's not a magic bullet. For illustration, a cure for hepatitis C already exists. However, even in the state of Vermont, current modeling suggests that hepatitis C will not be eradicated until after 2050 due to social determinants of health and the righteous distrust that many communities have in the current healthcare system. Another example is triple therapy for TB, which was once heralded as the breakthrough of the century, but now we're looking at drug-resistant TB as a global threat. And this becomes even more important when we consider international cooperation and intellectual property, as illustrated by the general comment. So the general comment 25 specifically references pandemics because, as we're currently witnessing, a local epidemic can become very quickly a pandemic with devastating consequences. And therefore, states should respond with transparency by, I quote, sharing the best scientific knowledge and its applications. Despite this obvious importance of international cooperation in 2020, transparency and international cooperation are not strong enough. You may have heard the term vaccine nationalism or advance market commitments. These are bilateral agreements between states and the pharmaceutical industry to allocate a certain amount of future vaccine doses in exchange for research funding. Now, this is deeply problematic because modeling from Northwestern University recently claimed that if the first 2 billion doses get bought up by affluent nations, rather than distributing a COVID vaccine in proportion to the global population, then almost twice as many people can die from COVID-19. So from this, collaboration as required by the right to science becomes inevitable, if not mandatory, in exchange for research funding. For overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic. Intellectual property protections often act counter to non-discriminatory, transparent, and participatory approaches to research and development. Advocates have been pointing out for years the challenges with equitable access to existing health commodities due to high prices deriving from patents and intellectual property rights. And this history illustrates the importance of the current global calls for a people's vaccine for COVID-19 as shepherded by UNAIDS. And the general comment notes that the right to science can actually help us mediate these tensions between IP protection and other human rights. So in closing, after all this unhappy news, we can actually, based on all of this that we've been talking about and the general comment and all these amazing colleagues on the panel, be really excited about what's ahead. Because it's easy to imagine that these right to science principles that we talked about will be informing campaigns, for example, to increase government funding for research, or to achieve equitable access to essential medicines, including those already available, but too expensive, even though they might be less harmful, treatment regimens, such as an available treatment regimen for TB that's not being implemented yet across the globe, even though current treatment can cause people to lose their hearing. Other campaigns could be fighting the privatization of knowledge by reclaiming science as a public good. And all these examples affect every one of us as people, as scientists, as human rights activists. So I hope you see that the general comment has this tremendous potential as a rallying point for health activists and members of civil society seeking a more responsive research agenda, a more equitable distribution of scientific benefits, and more secure commitment by states so that present and future generations will enjoy the benefits of scientific advancement free from discrimination. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And that's it.
Gisa, thank you very much. And I really want to thank the work that you and TAGGed do in general, and particularly in using the right to science as a mobilizing tool to really achieve access to health and medicine. So thank you. And to close off our panel, we're going to be turning to Marco Perduca. And in the meantime, I want to encourage everybody in the audience to keep your questions coming. Once Marco has finished his remarks, we will be turning to those questions and discussion with the panelists. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning, I would say, everyone from Rome. I am here on behalf of Science for Democracy, as the sign in my background says. Science for Democracy is the international evolution of a national NGO which was founded in 2002 to promote freedom of scientific research, because a gentleman whose name was Luca Coscioni, affected by amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, was betting on research on stem cells to find one day a cure for his problem. In the days in which the Italian parliament was debating a law on assisted reproductive techniques that would have prohibited any kind of scientific research on blastocysts. So if on the one hand, he was trying to promote a certain kind of technique, on the other was imposing hurdles to scientific research. And ever since the beginning of the year 2000, we have been engaged mainly at the national level the first couple of years to promote freedom of research. Then we understood that that was a problem distributed, unfortunately, equally around certainly Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. And so we decided to set up a series of events called World Congress for Freedom of Scientific Research that tried to promote what is now the core business of Science for Democracy. There is a dialogue based on evidences, but a dialogue between the scientific community and decision makers. And decision makers are certainly members of parliament, members of government, but also courts, because at the end of the day, some of the issues that I would like to address later today are also dealing with decisions taken by courts. We were happy to have Jessica as one of our speakers at the 5th session of the World Congress of Freedom of Scientific Research we had at the European Parliament in Brussels in April 2018. This year, possibly the last in-person event organized in 2020, we went to the Commission of the African Union, where thanks to the Commissioner for Research, Cameroonian Professor Sarah Agbor, we were able to have the 6th meeting of our Congress entirely dedicated to the right to enjoy the benefits of science, which is yet another way of calling the right to science. We are new to the game if we compare it to AAAS, but since 2015, we have started to advocate the rights to science in parts of the decision-making sphere that didn't even know that science was enshrined in the Universal Declaration, and certainly as an entire article dedicated in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I myself, I'm a former member of the Italian Senate. I've been there from 2008 to 2013. So I can tell from personal experience that science is very rarely addressed in those kind of fora. Italy doesn't have a committee that mentions science. Scientific committee issues are discussed by the Culture Committee. The European Parliament, unlike the US Congress, doesn't have a committee that speaks about science. It speaks about research and technology, but no science, while Congress has at least nominally in both chambers mentioned to science. So science is something that very rarely in this part of the world enters the public domain when we talk about legislations, when we talk about policies. And so finally, not only having the catchphrase that science is a human right, but also having a very comprehensive document, that is the general comment, could help us in our daily work. And the daily work is to try and establish this liaison between the decision makers and also science. Now, let me start with a negative example of how this dialogue hasn't happened also recently, and how also perhaps the general comment could have been a little more specific on talking about some cutting-edge issues. And the issues are biotechnology. We have biotechnology mentioned twice in the general comment, one in a very generic way, and the second one when we talk about biotechnology that can enable the cure or treatment of many diseases. Now, biotechnology can be used in very different ways. And despite the fact that it has been around for many decades now, the latest cutting-edge technologies have not been addressed in the general comment, despite the fact that we, as an NGO, have tried to directly with public side events when the committee was meeting in Geneva, but also indirectly through papers and some of the work that independent experts have done to consult with the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights have not been included. And one of them just won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. I'm talking about CRISPR. And on CRISPR in particular in Europe, we have a very complex, if not complicated situation. In July 2018, the European Court of Justice, in case C-528/16, ruled that organisms obtained by direct mutagenesis techniques are to be regarded as genetically modified organisms, GMOs, according to a directive that was adopted in 2001. So when CRISPR was being debated in very small circles in Ivy League universities, in particular in the United States, and in some very few labs in Europe. And so we decided to do something and perhaps this in part is also already replying to one of the questions that we understand is going to be posed next. How can civil society raise a problem when a court has taken a decision without having taken into consideration any of the scientific literature that has been produced? Or because Europe doesn't have a very clear mechanism on how to have a consultation between scientists and the courts or the European Commission, there's something that is called the scientific advisory mechanism, but it's not a binding body. And in fact, they issued their recommendation 3 months after the decision that I just mentioned, so they weren't contacted on time. How can we actually raise this lack of scientific arguments on the occasion of a decision that could pose a lot of problems when it comes to the application of biotechnologies for breeding plants, not only finding cures, because this is the other aspect of biotechnology, so-called green biotechnologies. They can be red, they can be white, they can also be green. And so we organized in Rome in front of the Chamber of Deputies, and then again in Milan in front of one of the best universities that studies CRISPRs, and finally in front of the European Parliament, CRISPR snacks. That is, we ate rice which had been genetically modified, denouncing our action to the public authorities and see how their reaction would be. So sort of, if you want, the classical civil disobedience that on some occasions people do to try and require a clarification on what is a right and what is not right, or what is a freedom and how you can actually enjoy this intersection between freedom and rights in your national country. Now, in Italy, nothing happened. The police at some point wanted to have a taste of our rice salad that we were eating. In Belgium, we were stopped by the authorities, questioned for 3 hours, and in the end, they didn't want to go into the lab to test the rice that we had eaten, because they said they needed to have half a kilo of it to carry out the research, which is of course not necessary, but they didn't want to take a decision to go against a decision taken by the European Court of Justice, which deals with what happens within the European Union, which doesn't have anything specific that specifically says that science is a human right. Because here the problem that we were trying to raise is, it's true that the right of science, that is the freedom to carry out research using CRISPR, is not blocked in Europe. You can work freely and safely within your lab. But the moment in which you want to take it to an open field and experiment, the kind of rice or maize or plums or tomatoes that you have been studying within your lab, there are problems. And after the decision of the court in Luxembourg, a lot of big universities and biotechnology centers also in the north of Europe had to stop their experimentation and trials because there was it wasn't clear how they should have proceeded. And so we now are saying, now that we have the general comment, that this decision should be reviewed according not only to the latest literature available, not only because the Scientific Academy in Sweden awarded the Nobel Prize to Jennifer Doudna and Michel Chamberlain for CRISPR, saying that they have, with this technology, they can rewrite the code of life, but because there is a clear, specific mention not to biotechnology in the general comment, but there's a clarification on the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle, which is, of course, been around for decades, and if let me read the paragraph. The principle is more broadly applied for the use and application of scientific outcomes. The precautionary principle should not hinder and prevent scientific progress, which is beneficial for humanity. Nonetheless, it should be able to address available risks for human health and the environment in the larger. Thus, in controversial cases, participation and transparency become crucial because the risks and potential of some technical advances of some scientific research should be made public in order to enable society, through informed, transparent, and participatory public deliberation, to decide whether or not the risks are acceptable. Now here, if you don't allow experimentation to go on, it's very complicated to have a demonstration of a risk and a harm. So what we will try to find the best possible way to go again. We cannot appeal the decision taken by the European Court of Justice, but we can certainly try and influence the debate that next year, we understand, may erupt again within the European Parliament when the 2001 GMO directive may be reviewed after 20 years of its application. A decision that has caused a lot of economic problem, I would say, more than damages to human animal health or the environment. So we're excited to see, even if the biotechnologies are not mentioned in a very comprehensive way in the general comment, that this clarification of how the precautionary principle should be applied, it can in fact help us push forward for some reform. And another issue on which I think we are going to use, so to speak, the general comment is the research on controlled substances. Next year, it's going to be the 60th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Single Convention on Narcotic and Psychotropic Substances. Now, for the last 60 years, the reason why those decisions were taken at the height of the Cold War, among other things, have not been taken into serious considerations. And the reasons why those documents had been written and adopted was to promote scientific and medical use of those plants, their derivatives, and all the chemical compounds that have been produced over the years. They had already been produced in the 50s or in the 30s and 50s already. One could think about LSD and MDMA. But so now we are ready to mark the adoption of this convention with a very bleak scenario in terms of progress in controlling non-medical and scientific use of those substances, but unfortunately also in not promoting their medical and scientific use. it was mentioned before, essential medicine. One of the derivatives of the opium poppy is morphine, and that's been included in the list of essential meds by the World Health Organization for some 40 years now. But if you go around the country, possibly the US, UK, and Australia, the only few, in Canada, the only few that don't have complicated legislation to prescribe those kind of products, but elsewhere in Europe, and you can imagine what happens in the rest of Latin America, Africa, or Asia, it is very complicated to prescribe. It is even more complicated to obtain it because its production is circumscribed to a few countries, and transporting those substances under international control is costly and bureaucratically very ineffective. So we hope that the specific mention to controlled substances and research on them is also is going to be helpful to try and instill a little bit of common sense in the debates that may happen at the UN Commission on drugs that is scheduled to take place in April 2021. And let me quote the last 4 lines of this part of the general comment that says the provision on research on those substances under control, and there are in the schedules of the 3 UN Convention on Drugs, is in principle a limitation of this right, the right to enjoy the benefits of science and its application, and should meet the requirements of Article 4 of the Covenant that obliges countries not to, states that have ratified the Covenant, not to adopt laws that go against all the other articles contained in the Covenant. Moreover, given the potential health benefits of those controlled substances, the restriction should also be weighed up in relation to the states parties' obligation under Article 12 of the Covenant, which is the article that talks about the right to health. So these are 2, if you want, more concrete examples of how this document can be used by human rights organizations, but also people that are trying to influence the decision-making process in some spheres. I would like to end my presentation with 2 other concrete suggestions. One is we need to have as many ratification of the optional protocol of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, so that we invite citizens of those member states to bring their complaints before a quasi-judicial body, which is the committee. The second is that we have to start a conversation about setting up a special rapporteur on the right to health, because health is so pervasive. I mean, science is the right to science. Sorry, science is present everywhere, and it needs to be monitored. The application, implementation of Article 15 needs to be monitored, and perhaps a special figure within the US system could be very helpful. Thank you very much, and I apologize if I went beyond my time.
Not at all, Marco. Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you to the full panel. We've had several questions come through, and I'm going to direct them to some of you specifically, but please, all of you should feel free to respond. Starting with you, Rebecca, there was a question about what actions academies of science and scientific organizations might take in countering growing anti-science behavior of political leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, this is a huge question and a great question, and I could go on for a long time, but I will not do that. I've been thinking about how to be concise with this. I mean, you know, as a general matter, obviously, academies of science and scientific organizations can, you know, keep providing science-based advice and recommendations to their governments. However, I think, Mindy, that's probably not the point that you're trying to make. You're asking about what happens when governments don't listen to that advice or take more of an anti-science approach. So many academies I know have been really trying to make sure that they take that message to the public, that they're making clear, they're being as clear as possible about what we understand about the science related to a particular issue. So that's why, another reason why science communication is so important in terms of building trust. And then I think, you know, also participatory approaches to science as well, being transparent about the work that you do when you're working on particularly sort of sensitive issues. Maybe it's related to equitable allocation of a vaccine, making sure that you hear different voices, open it up to the public. So building trust is important. And I think, as you know, I feel very strongly that there's a role for national academies in the community, scientific community, in speaking out about attacks on scientists and their work.
Thank you. Gisa, there's a question here that I think is probably best answered by you. The question is, as a right to the fruits of science, should vaccines and treatments for the pandemic or any pandemic be patented? If affirmative, who benefits?
That's really the question, for health across, ever since I think vaccines were first developed. Well, yes and no. I mean, there are lots of reasons to think about patents and to provide patents. The challenge with patents is, though, when it impedes access. And so we'll have to weigh, those patents and how they might be infringing on the right to science and the right to health and preventing people from access against, the possibility of not patenting them. Even if they are patented, there are ways in which, these could still be made available. Now, my standpoint would be to patent only if patenting does not impede access for everybody without discrimination. But even if and when patents are in place right now, there are things such as the TRIPS provisions, and there are things called compulsory licensing that would enable governments to still make patents available, to make vaccines that are patented available. Of course, there are additional challenges often to that. Manufacturing capacity would be one, but also additional bilateral agreements that might circumvent states' ability to implement these exceptions. So, as long as we're still operating with an open science concept, meaning that, people can have access to the knowledge and can have access to the data so that everybody could still get access to vaccines, patent away, but, just make sure that everybody can have access and that there is, in fact, a free vaccine for everybody across the world.
Thank you, Gisa. There's a question that was directed to Dr. Everly, but I think it could be answered maybe by Marco as well. So I pose it to at least the two of you. Can you speak to the difference between ethics and rights? It seems that the former is often emphasized to avoid enforceable obligations.
Marco, do you want to go, and I can follow up if you want?
Oh, sure. Well, I'm not sure that that's actually the definition that we want to attach to ethics. I would say that one has to do more with the philosophy behind than the laws that can be applied, and so rights are have more to do with laws. There is, I think there is also in the general comment at some point that there was a debate while in the final stages to address the issue of ethics, and in particular bioethics, when we talk about certain new developments, and certainly gene editing could be one of those, or anything that has to do with DNA, raises a lot of ethical issues. But we caution the committee not to elaborate too much on what ethics, or rather, how ethics should be included in the document, because I can make an example that perhaps could give a more concrete answer to that. In several instances, the ethical committee of universities and hospitals in my country, in Italy, have blocked experimentations or the use of novel treatment because it was, even if it was supposed to be compassionate use, because it was raising ethical issues. So ethics is important, certainly, but you have to take into consideration those who become the people that, in fact, give the guidelines for ethical responses to specific issues. And in some countries, there could be people that go beyond the decision makers, and could also include religious beliefs on the one hand, or perhaps non-scientific arguments on the other. And it's going to become very complicated to question ideologies, if not dogmas, within the framework of ethics, if you do not have a clear idea on what is the final objective, why you're raising an ethical issue. And so for us, I mean, rights, because we have over 60 years of codification of rights, should always be taken into consideration before ethical decisions, because they can be a fairer guide to the best outcome.
Thank you, Marco. Rebecca, would you like to add anything?
Sure. So I think this is another really great question, because I think it gets to this confusion about rights. I mean, I think there's often people sometimes who aren't really familiar with the international human rights framework kind of lump, maybe understandably have a tendency to lump ethics and human rights together and think of them as just, these are good things related to integrity. If we have an ethics code, we've got it covered. I'd be really interested to hear what Jessica has to say as well, because I know that AAAS has done a lot of work on integration of human rights into ethical codes. I would just say that, from my perspective, there's sometimes overlap. I mean, you have ethical codes that often govern associations, organizations that, deal with a variety of things, from research integrity to informed consent. So sometimes there's an overlap with human rights, but that there's not, they don't sort of, I don't know what the phrase is, map directly onto one another. And so, when we're talking about rights, and this is why I was saying, I think it's so important to engage with international human rights law, because when we're talking about rights, really what we're talking about is, first of all, it's human-centered. We're focusing on individuals who have rights because they enjoy these rights because of simply by the virtue of being human. And the international organization, states within the international community have recognized these rights and undertaken legal obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill them. And so I think there is this ongoing initiative to try to, integrate human rights into ethical codes, but they're not the same. So, but Jessica's really the expert on this.
Well, I don't know that I'm the expert on it. What I'll do is, there was a follow-up question about this question of human rights and ethics, and so maybe I'll respond to that. It says, it seems to me that the comment about differentiating ethics from the basic right to science is paramount. Is the right a right to access findings or to conduct research? It's a right to both. I would commend to you the first report that came out of the work that the Science and Human Rights Coalition did. We conducted 17 focus groups. This was a research project that was led by Dr. Margaret Patullo of the American Sociological Association and myself. And we worked with scientific membership organizations to conduct these 17 focus groups focus on what do scientists understand the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress meaning in the context of their discipline. And from that, I would say one of the key contributions that was made to defining what the right means was a conceptual framework of thinking about access in the context of the right. And it's a continuum of access where we have lay persons and all of us, even if you're a Nobel laureate in your field, you're a lay person in an unrelated field, to scientists practicing in their field. There is this continuum. And as you move along the continuum, that to which you need access changes. It's one thing to have access to Science magazine, but if you're not trained in the relevant field, what you really need are those findings translated in a way that makes sense to you. And as you move along the continuum, risk increases as well as you move towards access to data, if you move towards access to human subjects with whom to conduct your research. And so, yes, depending on what your motivation is, what your interests are, and what your training is, to require access, yes, you need access to findings and that for which you need to conduct research. And so, yes, the right encompasses all of that. I would also add that many years ago, we also did some work in thinking about the relationship between human rights and ethics, recognizing that the two frameworks actually have their genesis in the same moment in history, coming out of the Second World War. But they have taken different paths, and the way in which we use the tools can be quite different, but we're recognizing increasingly that they're complementary. So, for example, several years ago now, and I've lost track of time, but maybe it was about 10 years ago in the United States, the Presidential Bioethics Commission actually had a report specifically addressing human rights in the context of a bioethics disaster that occurred in Guatemala several decades ago, because they recognized the unique value of applying a human rights frame to who these individuals who were involved in the research. And as I think Marco expressed as well, thinking about the implications of ethical violations in a human rights frame adds particular, not just richness, but nuance and value. And so that is why we are increasingly seeing the frameworks brought together, because they are different, but they are complementary. So we're seeing them brought together increasingly in codes of ethics, and potentially in a frame for thinking about institutional ethics review, although I think that's a step yet to be taken. We had a question too about the connection between the general comment as it's expressed and data, issues of data justice. Could the general comment be used to address, for example, data disparities, data rich and data poor vulnerabilities, hypo and hyper surveillance? Is there anyone on the panel who'd like to take that question? Well, if no one's jumping in, I will share some thoughts. I will be frank that one of my frustrations with the general comment is that it addresses a lot. And I think, in my view, more than it needed to really enrich our understanding of the right to science. And so it means that you really need to delve into the text to see the extent to which it addresses this question specifically. In addition, even though it addresses a lot, something that needs to be teased out of the language, because it's not explicit for the most part, is how the right to science, seen as a positive, also relates to the responsibilities of science. Now, there is some language in the right, Marco mentioned about the precautionary principle. There is some mention of responsible development and application of science, but it isn't teased out terribly much. And I think that is work that still needs to be done. Part of the reason for that is that the right in the language of the treaty, even though there is an awful lot of language there, there's one main provision and 3 subparagraphs. They talk about the responsibility to ensure the scientific freedom and the freedom to conduct research, but nowhere in the language of the treaty itself does it specifically talk about responsibilities. And so that, I think, is still work that needs to be done. I think it's implicit in the fact that this is a right encased within a human rights framework. And as I said, the general comment talks about this, but only to a limited extent, and certainly not specifically with regard to data. Yes, Gisa.
Yeah, it's just coming to this question that, I think is a really good question and that bears some thinking about, which shows us that really we are just at the beginning of figuring out how we can use this general comment across the sciences and human rights. You know, I do want to point out the fact that non-discrimination and access and also availability are really central to the right. So to the extent that you're looking at a specific issue with data, you know, data existing, non-existing data, it might bear looking at the underlying factors that lead to this situation, assuming that you're talking, you know, that the question comes from a very specific problem somebody is looking at, and just analyzing them from this framework of non-discrimination, accessibility and availability.
Thank you, Gisa. There's a follow-up question to Marco's comment on the precautionary principle. And it says, regarding the precautionary principle, can you share an example of how society or community members are able to participate in a decision regarding whether scientific progress benefits humanity? I think, Marco, particularly given your place in Europe, where a lot of innovative work has gone on in this area for some time, you're probably best placed to answer this.
Thank you. I only wanted to say before that data is mentioned again, like biotechnology, like 3-4 times, but also in very general terms. Also, privacy is mentioned once in the general comment. But sometimes when you have to deal with issues that are not inside the general comment or not inside the covenant that we're talking about, you have to go and look into other covenants. And here the ICCPR, the one on civil and political rights, if, and I understood the problem was perhaps about big data and how your personal information may be taken away from you, could also help. Well, there is one of the issues that the general comment suggests, or one of the reasons why it's very helpful, because it incites civil society to contribute to the decision-making process, and not only in letting the decisioners know that there is such a thing as a general comment and the right to science, but also in producing literature. So if we have to go back again to one of the plants that I mentioned before, cannabis, the European Commission is trying to adopt a regulation on novel food. And one of the active principles of cannabis, which is called CBD, which is not even inside the 3 UN Convention, is now posing a lot of problems because it is considered to be a psychoactive substance. So the private sector has earmarked 4 million euros to produce within the framework of 24 months, science studies, peer-reviewed studies, of course, to try and demonstrate what they believe should be the best way to address the issue here. So advocacy on the one hand, certainly, but also private institutions that can also, well, the US has more private institutions than Europe, but also private labs or research center could also contribute with their own peer-reviewed literature to try and influence the decision-making and try and balance. I don't know if this could be for the benefit of humanity, but it's certainly, if something hasn't proven to be dangerous or harmful for over 20 years, first, and there's no literature that can counter the original affirmation of the precautionary principle, a public awareness campaign on the lack of it, that could also be something that civil society groups or individuals or academies of sciences should do.
Thank you. We had a quick question regarding how science is actually defined in the general comment. There is a lot of language there, but I think what's really important to point out about the way that the general comment defines science is, first, it recognizes that science is captured in both the natural and the social sciences. But it's also not just the knowledge or the products that arise through science, but it's the process itself. And so I think it's important to recognize that. And I think that's one of the contributions that the work of this coalition did in helping inform the content of the general comment. We have 1 minute. So I'm not sure that that's enough time for a full question. Do any of our panelists have any quick last-minute remarks that you would like to add before we close?
I would also like to invite you all to another webinar that we're going to organize on 10th November, which is World Day for science, peace, and development. Jessica is going to be one of our panels, but to try and insist on the divulgation of the existence of the right to science, because that's the most important work we have to do for the next time.
Thank you, Marco. Would either of our other panelists like to add some last words? Gisa.
Yeah, just, you know, in the spirit of all of us being together here, just trying to encourage everybody to, you know, whether you're working on science or human rights, or, you know, in whichever connection of the both, do look at the general comment. Do not be scared. There is the UN language is what it is, but, you know, for many scientists, it won't be that difficult, and just take your time. There really is a lot for all of us to distill from there, and I think to take forward. Really, again, want to reiterate that this is the beginning, and that, you know, if we could come together on a few of these questions and themes that were raised today, we can really, you know, make this world a better place.
Thank you. Thank you so much to my three panelists, to Dr. Rebecca Everly, to Gisa Dang, and to Marco Perduca for sharing with us your insights and your excitement about this next phase, the most important phase, I think, probably in really seeing the value of the right to science and seeing it put into practice. So thank you. And with that, I will turn over to our next panel.